Hi, I'm Sadie Mays, and this is my second trimester final project for AP Euro. The first topic of my final presentation is the French Revolution of 1789. At the end of the 18th century, the French people are discontent, they are divided into social classes, there's growing hostility between the social classes, and the government has no power or reserves from which to draw upon and save itself. Europe was under the old regime, where an absolute ruler dominates the people who are divided into classes. There was the privileged people who were rich and didn't have to pay taxes, and then there was the unprivileged people who did pay taxes and were very poor. The three estates made up the French representative government, and the first estate was the clergy, the second was the nobility, and the third was everyone else. Each estate had only one vote, despite the fact that the third estate consisted of 98% of the population. King Louis XVI calls a meeting of the Estates General in 1789, and each estate comes with a plan to increase their own position and political power. Due to the directionalist arguments, Louis XVI locks the representatives of the Third Estate out of the meeting place for the Estates General. In retaliation, the Third Estate's representatives then declare themselves the National Assembly, and they take the tennis court oath where they swear not to disband until they have written a new constitution for France. In response to the formation of the National Assembly, King Louis XVI orders them to disband. When they refuse, the king orders the first two estates to join the National Assembly and has mercenaries surround the city of Paris. Due to the threat to the city, rebels stormed the Bastille on July 14, 1789. The Bastille was a prison for political prisoners and a prominent symbol of the power of the French monarch. The people tear it to ground brick by brick, looting all gunpowder and weaponry they can find from the prison. The city now has an armed force, and the tricolor flag emerges as a symbol of the revolution. By the end of August 1789, the feudal system is completely eradicated from France, and the National Assembly issues the Declaration of the Rights of Man and the Citizen on August 27th. The Women's March on Versailles occurs due to the starvation of their families and economic desperation. The royals are forced to live in the Tuileries Palace in Paris, leaving the traditional home of the monarch, Versailles. The king has become a figurehead and a puppet of the revolution. The new government leaders make the French Constitution of 1791, and the king is forced to accept it. The Roman Catholic Church is made subservient to the state, and the royal family attempts to flee from France but fails, earning them the hatred of the people. The Habsburgs try to restore Louis to power, but the French declare war on Austria instead. France is now fighting a civil war and a foreign war simultaneously, with Girondists and Jacobins emerging as the dominant political groupings. Marat, Danton, and Robespierre are all part of the Jacobin group and are the leaders of the revolution. The Jacobin group is extremely radical, and they come to control the French government through the Committee of Public Safety. They have the one-time monarchs of France guillotined after a show trial in October of 1793. This initiated the Reign of Terror. For the Committee of Public Safety, the most important goal was to destroy those that opposed the French Revolution, and they legalized the execution of anyone who was not 100% behind the revolution. Marat is assassinated by the Girondin Charlotte Corday in 1793, and soon after, Robespierre, the leader of the Reign of Terror, is arrested and put on trial. His death by guillotine in 1794 ends the Reign of Terror. The outcome of the French Revolution is a weak and divided France, which left the door open for Napoleon Bonaparte to swoop in and seize control. Napoleon was born in 1769 in Corsica to the low-class nobility Bonaparte family. He had been educated in military matters from the age of 9 and became a military hero and top general through the French Revolution. During the Thermidorian reaction, while the Directory was in power, he gained command of the Army of Italy. After a failed campaign in Egypt, he was welcomed back as a hero due to his self-sponsored propaganda and the treasures he returned with. He was also a brilliant general who strategized in new and different ways, calculating strategies that used his troops with maximum efficiency. Due to the residual governmental disarray from the revolution, Napoleon launched a successful coup in 1799, proclaiming himself as the first consul, disposing of the elected assembly France had had before. The Concordat of 1801 was an agreement between Napoleon and the Pope to make amends for the Church's losses during the French Revolution, but it was mostly an image booster for Napoleon. A year after the Concordat, Napoleon promoted himself to sole consul for life, and in 1804 he crowned himself Emperor of the Empire of France. He made many reforms during his reign, including the institution of meritocracy, the centralization of French administration, the establishment of the lycée system of education for advanced students, the creation of the Legion of Honor, and the writing of the Code of Napoleon in 1804. Napoleon was also constantly at war. He was almost addicted to battle and conquest, to leading the troops on campaigns. In 1805, he was crowned the King of Italy and defeated Russia and Austria at the Battle of Austerlitz. Austerlitz is considered one of history's greatest battles and Napoleon's greatest victory. In 1806, he defeated Prussian forces in the Confederation of the Rhine and invaded Berlin, forcing it to declare the Continental System. The Continental System was a form of economic warfare with England that prohibited the continent to trade with the British unless they wished to face Napoleon in battle. From 1807 to 1810, he was at war with Portugal because they disobeyed the Continental System, and with Spain because they refused to help him invade Portugal. Another development of 1807 was Napoleon's divorce of Josephine, his empress and wife. He needed a child to continue his legacy, and she had grown too old to provide one, so he divorced her despite the fact that she was the love of his life. He remarried to Marie Louise of Austria in 1810, gaining support of the Habsburg dynasty. Their first child, a son, was born a year later. Always a family man, Napoleon had set up his various relatives on thrones of the various nations he had conquered. Invading Russia in 1812. What he had thought to be a decisive victory turned into a long and fruitless campaign due to Russian slash-and-burn tactics. A year after the failed Russian campaign, Napoleon was defeated at the Battle of Nations in Leipzig. In 1814, he abdicated and was exiled to the Isle of Elba. A year later, he escaped and seized power again, only to meet his final defeat at Waterloo and be exiled to the prison of St. Helena, a tiny island in the South Atlantic. He died there in 1821. Napoleon's legacy is that many of his reforms stand to this day, and the global spread of the ideas of the French Revolution through his conquests and warfare. After Napoleon's final defeat at Waterloo, representatives of the nations involved in the Napoleonic Wars came together in the Congress of Vienna, with the Austrian Empire's foreign minister Clemens von Metternich emerging as an essential figure. This was a highly conservative group, and they solidified the borders of Europe. Their policies ignored the growing forces of liberalism and nationalism, focusing more on the ways of the old regime and on turning back the clock to before the Napoleonic Wars. My next topic will be the Industrial Revolution. But before the Industrial Revolution could take place, there had to be the Agricultural Revolution, where crop yields were improved with the 4-field crop rotation system, and where the wealthy bought up common land and enclosed it for private use only. Enclosure meant that people either had to become a tenant farmer or give up farming and move to the city. The majority of the population did the latter, and the population increase exploded with the abundance of food. A new system of work became popular, which was the domestic system, where an entrepreneur would sell raw materials to a family of spinner and weavers. They would make the materials into cloth and sell back to the entrepreneur. The entrepreneur would then go sell the finished goods at the market for a profit and use the money to buy raw materials, starting the whole process again. The development of the cotton gin and the spinning jenny both sped up the process of cloth making exponentially. Now, the Industrial Revolution was centered around Britain. Why is that, you may ask? It is because of the geography of the island nation. Britain had an abundance of water to run hydro and steam-powered machines, as well as multiple resources of both iron and coal. Iron could be used to make steel, an invention of the Revolution, and also the very fact that Britain was an island was helpful in its industrialization because, with the strongest navy in the world, it had no fear of invasion from pesky neighbors, a plight that troubled all of Europe throughout history. The invention of the power loom is what really set off the Industrial Revolution and ended the success of the domestic system. Power looms were too big and expensive for a small household, so textile development was taken over by large factories. Factories were built near sources of power and required a lot of capital investment, so the system kept those who were wealthy enough to invest in or own a factory rich, and the poor were forced to work long hours in unhealthy conditions for minimal wages. Transportation also changed drastically with the invention of the railroad and locomotives. Between 1811 and 1813, Britain suffered incredible economic stress due to the continental system imposed by Napoleon. and this only served to encourage the government to support the factory system so that profit for exports could be increased. Naturally, protests to the factory system occurred, the most powerful coming from the Luddites between 1811 and 1816. The Luddites were artisans who had lost their jobs and social standings to the factory system. They were often prone to violent protests, especially to the destruction of factory machinery. In response to the Luddites, the British government did its best to quell the riots and to establish its control more firmly, but it did not address the cause of the riots. The end of Luddism came with the male workers gaining the right to vote, the legalization of trade unions, and the punishment of many Luddites. Over 100 were either killed in the riots, executed, deported to Australia, or given long-term prison sentences. The Luddites movement had drastic political consequences affecting the outlook on the factory system and on technology. The government could no longer ignore the desperate situation factory workers lived in, and debates began to spring up about the factory system and industrialization. In 1819, the Peterloo Massacre occurred, where British government officials misinterpreted the gathering of people listening to political anti-factory speeches as a riot and fired on the crowd. Casualty rate was fairly low, but it caused quite the political stir and aroused sentiment from the people for more rights. The factory system was built on an incredibly exploitive way of thinking, looking only at profit and not at the human cost of the money. Many children worked in factories, and they were actually the factory's preferred employees because they were paid less and were smaller, so they could get into places adults couldn't and do repair or maintenance. Life expectancy rates dropped significantly, and many children became deformed from the pressure of intense labor on their growing bodies or from machines tearing their limbs off. By 1832, conditions were so bad that Parliament began interviewing the workers, who were mostly children, and their caretakers about conditions, and the results of such interviews was the Factory Act of 1833, which only limited the numbers of hours for workers. The Factory Act of 1844 was also very important in the limitation of the hours of child and female workers. During this time, the middle class grew and gained a more luxurious lifestyle, while the lower class barely scraped by a living. The living conditions of the poor were highly unsanitary, leading to the pandemics of waterborne diseases such as cholera, which raged rampant until its cause, unsanitary water, was found in 1854. Even after the discovery of the cause of cholera, it still took years before the disease was effectively safeguarded against in Britain. Moving on to the revolutions of 1830 and 1848. These revolutions were tipped off by the French Revolution of 1789 and were fought for many of the same reasons. The most important traits of this time were liberalism and nationalism. The first revolutions did not actually occur in 1830 or 1848, but in 1804 and 1817, when Serbians of the Balkan region revolt against the Ottoman Empire, a foreign power that has ruled them for 300 years. The revolution was successful due to the support they were given by Russia. It was no easy feat, but Serbia did achieve autonomy. In 1821, Greece rebelled for the same reasons as the Serbians, and after a decade-long struggle, they were able to unite with the help from the sympathetic countries of the West. In 1825, the Decembrist revolt of Russia occurred due to mixed opinions over who should assume the Russian throne and become the next Tsar. The Decembrists were crushed completely, but they became martyrs and ideals for the Russian liberals' cause. In 1830 and 1831, 5 different countries saw revolts, which were Belgium, France, Parma, Modena, and Poland. France was governed by Louis XVIII, a constitutional Bourbon monarch reinstated by the Congress of Vienna in 1814. He imposed censorship and made the government more conservative, then died in 1824, leaving his brother, Charles X, on the French throne. Charles X tried to restore absolute monarchy through a series of reforms, but instead the people revolted. Charles X fled to England, and the French people put Louis Philippe, the citizen king, on the throne. The government was now under the control of the middle class and ignored the needs of the workers. In 1830, Belgium also won its independence from the combined Belgian-Dutch kingdom that had been created by the Congress of Vienna in 1815. There were wide differences between the Belgians and the Dutch, including language, religion, and prevalent lifestyle. Their revolt was successful after 1 year due to the support of Britain and France, who were hoping to profit by trading with an independent Belgium. Poland also tried to gain its independence in 1830, but they were crushed by the Russians because they didn't have any outside support. No one stood to gain from Polish independence, so no outside European nation really cared enough to fight for the Poles. Also, the revolutionaries were divided amongst themselves between radicals and moderates who couldn't agree. The results of the 1830s revolutions was either success for the middle class alone or failure, and this left a disgruntled working class. The revolutions were far from over. Before the revolutions of 1848, there were both short and long-term issues, the most notable of which were food crises due to the overpopulation and potato blight of Ireland. In 1848, the French have yet another revolution due to displeasure with the King Louis Philippe. In February, the king loses control, abdicates, and flees to Britain. A second republic was declared by the Chamber of Deputies, and there is growing social tensions between the middle class and the workers. Later that year, during the June days, the workers rose against the middle-class government, accusing them of betraying the revolution. The workers wanted a redistribution of wealth and income. General Louis Cavaignac assumed dictatorial powers and crushed the rebels, but a new constitution that didn't change much was written in 1848. The only major change was an elected president. In the election, Louis Napoleon became president from popular Napoleonic legend, and he brought another new constitution in 1849 and crowned himself Emperor Napoleon III in his 1851 coup d'etat. The Austrians also experienced a revolution in 1848, where various ethnic minorities of the diverse empire sought nationalistic goals. The Austrian government was reactionary and ineffective. The rebellion faced Metternich as their chief opponent, but he was overthrown and he fled, and a revolutionary government was installed. However, the new government was weak and ineffective, and the Habsburgs were restored by the end of the year. However, serfdom was abolished, which is really the only point of my speaking for the last 30 seconds on the Austrian Revolution of 1848. In this year, Italy revolted as well, desiring to get rid of Habsburg control. They failed, oppressed from north and south by Austria and France. The Pope was restored in Rome after the failed revolution. The Germans also tried to revolt in 1848. Hoping for national unity, but they too failed. Their cause for failure being that their revolutionary force was split between liberals and conservatives who couldn't agree. The 1848 revolutions failed for a multitude of reasons, the primary ones being an uncommitted middle class who liked the idea of change but not the actuality of revolution, a form of nationalism that divided more than united, and a failure to attract supporters from both inside and outside the country. However, one important note about the year 1848 is that is when Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels published their joint work, the Communist Manifesto, that called for an international communist revolution. After the 1848 revolutions, the formation of two nations would occur, and these developments would drastically affect the power balance in Europe that had been structured by the Congress of Vienna. These two nations were Italy and Germany. The Italian unification is also called the Risorgimento, which is Italian for resurgence. The Italian peninsula had been fragmented since before the Renaissance, with Italy being a geographical reference only. The peninsula was divided into glorified city-states with separate rulers. One of these states was that of Piedmont Sardinia, in which Camillo Bonsejo, the Count of Cavour, came to power as prime minister in 1852. He would play an essential role in the unification to come, and he dreamed of an expanded Piedmont. The king Cavour serves is Victor Emmanuel II. Giuseppe Garibaldi was another key player in the unification of Italy, conquering all of southern Italy between 1860 and 1861, and then relinquishing his power to Victor Emmanuel for the sake of a unified Italy. By this time, Italy is unified except for Venice and Rome. 6 years later, Venice is given to the new Italian monarchy for siding with Prussia in the 7 Weeks' War. In 1870, during the Franco-Prussian War, Italy seizes Rome and is completely unified, naming Rome the capital of Italy a year later. In 1848, Germany had attempted a nationalistic revolution but failed, and as a result, the Germanic peoples were governed by many different systems and separate governments. This entire group was called the German Confederation, which had a weak governing body headed by Prussia, who had taken it from Austria in the 1830s. At the Frankfurt Assembly, liberals offered the throne of the United Germany to the Prussian king, but he refused. Germany remained divided, but desiring unity. The Zollverein was the trade confederation between them all. Bismarck became the Prussian prime minister in 1862, and his policies were realistic and efficient. He wanted to use the Prussian army to unite Germany under Prussian leadership. He engineers Austria's defeat in the Austro-Prussian War of 1866 in 7 weeks. He used this victory to establish the new North German Confederation, which was ruled by Prussia. Bismarck then manipulated circumstances so that France attacked Prussia in 1870. This initiated the Franco-Prussian War that lasted from 1870 to 1871 and resulted in France's defeat. Bismarck had ensured the isolation of his enemy ahead of time, also procuring alliances for the southern Germanic states in the case that France should attack. Upon such an event, they gave over their autonomy in exchange for Prussian protection. The outcome of the Franco-Prussian War was an aggressive treaty against France and the declaration of the German Empire, with Bismarck as its chancellor. Thus, Germany is unified. After the Italian and German unifications came La Belle Époque, from 1871 to 1914. La Belle Époque, or the Beautiful Era, is a time of political stability despite tensions between various nations. Characteristics of La Belle Époque are materialism, a higher standard of living. The population of Europe had increased, particularly in cities and urban areas. There was a second revolution of industry, as steam power was replaced with electricity, enabling the development of cars, planes, and submarines. Free trade became prevalent, particularly in England, and the economy was now global, with world markets. Democracy is advanced, with the working class getting the vote and the creation of the welfare state. Socialism was becoming an attractive idea, and the majority of the people had faith in science alone. Charles Darwin lived during this time and published his works, writing about evolution and the survival of the fittest, two ideas that will become very important later down the road. During this time, Queen Victoria ruled Britain, and the leading European nations would hold large gatherings to show off their wealth, power, and class to the other nations that led society. In France, the Third Republic was declared, and in response, the socialist Paris Commune was established to reject the conservative Third Republic. The Commune controlled Paris for 2 months before disintegrating. France was once again at civil war, and at this time, the city of Paris was sacked by the Third Republic, which was very politically unstable. In England, Queen Victoria ruled, and the Second Reform Bill was passed in 1867, which extended the franchise as well as eliminating and equalizing the voting system. Gladstone and Disraeli alternate as prime ministers, each causing reforms and disagreeing with the other due to the fact that they belong to different political wings. In 1914, Home Rule for Ireland passes through both houses, and the Irish are permitted their own government. During this time, the British Empire was immense, spanning 1/6 of the world's land in Victoria's reign and 1/4 in Edward VII, who was Victoria's successor. The Labour Party eclipses the Liberals in the English Parliament during this time, and the beginnings of a welfare state are made. The very important Parliament Act of 1911 occurred, in which the House of Lords gave up some essential political advantages because the king bullied them into it. Queen Victoria died in 1901 and left a legacy of hindered women's rights, imperialism, alliances, and related European monarchs that carry hemophilia. In the German Empire, Prussia is calling the shots, with the Kaiser at the helm and his trusty sidekick Bismarck. Bismarck sees socialists as a real threat and was dismissed by Kaiser Wilhelm II. Anti-Semitism and suffrage movements grew, particularly the militant suffragette movement that demanded votes for women. The suffragettes were led by Emmeline Pankhurst, and they demanded equal rights for women, originally starting liberal methods, but then turning to terrorism and civil disobedience such as arson, vandalism, and the planting of bombs. In jail, they would go on hunger strikes until the British government force-fed them and created the Cat and Mouse Act of 1913. Only the outbreak of World War I stopped the violence. The next section I will talk about is imperialism. There are 5 forms of imperial control: a colony, a protectorate, a sphere of influence, annex, and an economic or military aid. There were many reasons for European expansion into other areas, and the main motives had to do with the European sense of superiority and the advantages added land and resources would provide. There was also a sense of competition between the European nations, each one trying to be the best at colonization and controlling foreign lands. A poem very telling about the attitudes of this time period was The White Man's Burden by Rudyard Kipling. Also growing in popularity during this time period was the notion of social Darwinism, which justified racism and the oppression of different ethnic groups through the use of Darwin's theories of evolution and survival of the fittest. I told you they'd be important. It was the age of imperialism that the British East Trading Company took over India after the collapse of the Mughal Empire. India was considered the most valuable colony of England, and the British justified their occupation of India as the duty to civilize the people there. A native Indian person who fought for the British people was called a sepoy, and in 1857 the sepoy mutiny occurred because the new cartridges in their guns were greased with animal fat, which was sacrilegious for both Hindus and Muslims. It took a year, but eventually the British brutally suppressed the revolt, and the British government used this as an excuse to crown Queen Victoria as the Empress of India. The British would rule India until 1947, when Gandhi would lead the independence movement. During this time, Britain also expanded itself into China, gaining spheres of influence through the Opium Wars, which occurred when the Chinese tried to stop the Brits from bringing opium into their country with naval force. The British retaliate, and the result of the wars is that China depended upon the British government and the continued trade of opium in exchange for goods made in China, such as silk, ceramics, and tea. The scramble for Africa occurred between 1881 and 1914, and its name was right on the money. It was literally various European nations conquering as much African land as they could with the technological advances they had. One of the most influential inventions in the scramble for Africa was the Maxim gun, which was an automatic machine gun that could kill with an efficiency the world had never seen before. The final topic I will speak about in this presentation is World War I, which broke out in 1914, and the causes of said war can be summed up in the acronym MANIA, which stands for Militarism, Alliances, Nationalism, Imperialism, and Assassination. To clarify the alliances portion of the acronym, I must inform you that a delicate balance of power throughout Europe had been forged. Germany, Italy, and the dual kingdom of Austria-Hungary formed the Triple Alliance, and Britain, France, and Russia formed an alliance to counter that called the Triple Entente. The final letter of the acronym, assassination, is the spark that set off the First Global War. In 1914, the Archduke of Austria and heir to the Habsburg throne, Franz Ferdinand, was assassinated by Gavril Princip. Princip was a part of the Black Hand, which was an organization for Serbian dominance that preferred to use terrorism to achieve their goals. Due to the assassination, Austria declares war on Serbia after securing support from their German ally. Russia began mobilizing, and this caused Germany to declare war on Russia. Italy hung back from the combat due to its own interest in the Balkan region. Germany's declaration of war against Russia causes France and Britain to get involved, as they had agreed to do in the formation of the Triple Entente. The group held together by the Entente became known as the Allies, and their opposers were known as the Central Powers. What made World War I a global war instead of a pan-European one? The main answer to this question is that the imperialism of the age prior to the war meant that when war was declared, the countries participating involved their colonies. Various other nations joined in for different reasons, generally to protect or gain political power or territory. The major countries that joined the Allies were Italy in 1915, Japan in 1914, and the United States in 1917. The major country that joined the Central Powers was the Ottoman Empire in 1914. The weaponry of World War I was vastly different from the weapons that had been used in warfare previously. The development of trench warfare fixed war fronts and turned the Great War into a war of attrition. The generals of the war valued the lives of their soldiers very little and were fixed on the ideals of warfare from ages past. They kept sending their men over the top of the trenches to be mowed down by Maxim guns wielded by their enemies in the name of glory and honor, and as well as nationalistic pride. Despite the fact that these offensive maneuvers only killed their men, the generals on both sides tried them repeatedly due to imperialistic arrogance. World War I was the first total war due to its extended campaigns. The entire population was involved in the war, either on the home front or the front lines. Propaganda and censorship were both heavily relied on by the government, and democratic governmental affairs were paused for the duration of the war to ensure a strong leadership. Life in the trenches was very harsh, not only from the constant barrage of gunshots and artillery fire, but also from the rats, lice, weather conditions. Remember, they were standing outside with no shelter for hours on end. And trench foot. Trench foot is an infection that occurs from constant exposure to cold and wet conditions. It was very painful, starting only with itching, but eventually leading to the disintegration of skin and muscle tissues, which exposes the body to other infections as well. Life in the trenches were unsanitary, to say the least. There were many great poets during World War I, and some of my personal favorite poems are My Boy Jack by Rudyard Kipling, Lights Out by Edward Thomas, The Centigraph by Charlotte Mew, and, of course, Dulce et Decorum Est by Wilfred Owen. These poems all effectively show the horrors of war and the true ideals behind World War I. The end of the active fighting of World War I occurred in 1918 with a ceasefire, and the countries involved in the war met in Paris to formulate the Treaty of Versailles. The leaders of the major Allied powers dictated the treaty, but it took over 5 months of the negotiation due to the many different political agendas. In the end, the treaty crippled Germany, holding them accountable for the war and for reparations. They also stripped Germany of their Kaiser, setting up the Weimar Republic. Austria-Hungary was no longer an empire, but got divided into many smaller states. Italy, who had sided with the Allies at high cost, did not receive many benefits, neither money nor territory, and was enraged, as Japan was for similar reasons. Russia, which had extracted itself from the war in 1917 to resolve matters after the Russian Revolution, was offended at not being invited to negotiations. In short, the treaty was unable to please anyone and set up the divisions that would dictate the forces of World War II. This concludes my final project for AP Euro in the second trimester. Hope you enjoyed it!